Imagine for a moment a master sculptor standing before a large, rough block of marble. The stone is beautiful in its own way, but it is not yet what the sculptor envisions. With each strike of the chisel, pieces are broken away, and at first it seems like the stone is being destroyed. Yet, as the process unfolds, something incredible emerges. A masterpiece, shaped with purpose, precision, and care. In much the same way, God, the master creator, often breaks us before he can use us, molding us into vessels that can carry his glory in ways we never thought possible. When we say that God breaks the man he wants to use, we must immediately confront a misunderstanding that often arises in the Christian mind. The word break can carry the sting of condemnation, of divine rejection, or of some final punitive judgment. But in truth, God's breaking is never a punishment for the man he intends to use. It is preparation. It is a necessary, though painful, reshaping of the soul, so that it can bear the weight of a holy calling. This process of breaking may feel, in the moment, indistinguishable from punishment. It comes clothed in suffering, obscurity, disappointment, failure, and often in prolonged waiting. A man may be stripped of the very things he once believed qualified him for ministry or purpose: his talents, his reputation, his influence, even his sense of identity. At times, God seems to remove every prop that upheld a man's sense of self, until all he is left with is the God who called him. That is not cruelty, it is mercy in a form we do not easily recognize. Think of a skilled sculptor working with a block of stone. To the untrained eye, each strike of the chisel appears violent, as if the artist is ruining something perfectly solid. But the sculptor sees what is hidden within the stone and must remove what does not belong. So too with God. The breaking we endure is not meaningless pain, it is intentional. It is not random suffering, it is a deliberate preparation for something that we, in our current form, could not handle. One of the clearest patterns throughout Scripture is that God never calls someone into significant spiritual work without first reducing him, not in worth, but in self-reliance. The call of God is not simply an invitation to action, it is a summons to transformation, and that transformation requires unmaking. The man must be undone, not because God enjoys undoing, but because the old structures of ego, pride, self-dependence, and worldly thinking cannot support the architecture of a life surrendered to God. Before you build a cathedral, you must level the ruins that already occupy the site. There are countless examples of this principle in the Bible. Consider Joseph, sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused and forgotten in a dungeon. Years passed between his dreams and their fulfillment, and in those years something essential in Joseph was being shaped. Not his ambition or his intellect, those were already present, but the humility, the patience, the readiness to forgive, the dependence on God rather than position. Those were born in the breaking. When Pharaoh finally called him, Joseph no longer pointed to himself. He said, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer." That was the voice of a broken man prepared to be used. Likewise, Moses was broken in the wilderness. Once a prince of Egypt, confident in his own strength, he attempted to bring justice by his own hand and failed. He fled to the desert, not for a few weeks, but for 40 years. In the silence of Midian, among sheep rather than soldiers, Moses was slowly remade. And when God appeared in the burning bush, calling him to return, Moses no longer believed in his own ability. He protested, hesitated, and asked, "Who am I?" This was not false humility. It was the voice of one who had been stripped of illusions. He had been broken, and so he was now usable. This process is not limited to biblical giants. It continues in every generation. The breaking of a man may involve illness, betrayal, financial loss, the collapse of dreams, or the quiet ache of prolonged obscurity. In each of these, God is not watching from a distance. He is intimately involved, cutting away what will not serve the greater purpose. This is what preparation looks like when heaven is the architect. The tools God uses are not applause or ease, but silence, loneliness, and trust in the unseen. It is important to understand that this kind of breaking is not the same as despair. God does not break us to discard us. He breaks to prepare. The pain is real, but so is the purpose. And the mark of divine preparation is that when the time comes, the man who has been broken no longer seeks to be impressive, he seeks to be faithful. He is no longer obsessed with outcome, but with obedience. That is the kind of man God can trust with his work. We often long for God to use us, but recoil at the method he employs. We want to carry his glory without carrying the cross that precedes it. Yet those whom God would use in deep and lasting ways must be emptied first. It is not punishment. It is the painful mercy of divine preparation. The paradox of strength in weakness is one of the most profound and unsettling truths in the Christian life. It defies natural logic and unsettles the instincts of the human heart, which so often equates strength with power, confidence, and control. Yet Scripture consistently presents a different kind of strength, a strength that emerges not from self-assurance or visible success, but from surrender, from dependency, and from brokenness. In the divine economy, weakness is not a defect to be hidden, but often the very channel through which God reveals his power. To understand this paradox is to begin to understand how God works not only through us, but in us. Human strength, by nature, resists God. It is proud, it is self-sufficient, and it is determined to carve out its own destiny. It does not pray unless pressed. It does not surrender unless cornered. It does not wait unless all doors are closed. Yet the strength that God desires is of a different substance. It is forged in dependence, purified by trial, and anchored not in the self, but in the sufficiency of Christ. This is why Paul, in his second letter to the Corinthians, after pleading with God to remove his thorn in the flesh, heard something entirely unexpected. God did not promise to remove the affliction. Instead, he said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul's response was not confusion, but joy. He said, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." This is not mere poetry, it is spiritual reality. God does not work through human strength as the world defines it. The man who stands tall in his own might will often find God's power bypassing him. But the man bowed low, the one who has been emptied of his illusions of control, is the one through whom God's strength flows most freely. It is not that God is looking for the weakest people as if to merely display contrast, but that he knows his strength will never truly shine through a vessel still full of itself. There is something in weakness that invites divine presence in a way strength never can. Weakness humbles. It strips away the layers of pride and self-importance that insulate us from dependence. When a man is weak, truly weak, he cannot pretend, he cannot perform, he cannot manipulate outcomes or lean on his charm or intellect. All he can do is cling to the God who is strong, and this clinging is not failure, it is faith. It is the kind of faith that moves mountains. not because the person is powerful, but because the one he leans on is. In God's view, strength is not measured by the absence of struggle, but by the presence of trust in the midst of it. Strength is not the thunder of accomplishment, but the quiet, steadfast dependence on the Father's will. It is not self-will in action, but self-will laid down. This is why Jesus, the most powerful man who ever lived, did not come as a conquering king, but as a suffering servant. At the height of his earthly ministry, he knelt to wash feet. At the climax of his obedience, he allowed himself to be nailed to a cross. This is divine strength. The strength to yield, to forgive, to endure, and to love without condition. True strength is not proved in the absence of wounds, but in how those wounds are carried. A man who has been through suffering and has not hardened, who has faced betrayal and still chooses love, who has been disappointed and still believes. This is strength. The world applauds the man who climbs the ladder and makes himself great. Heaven applauds the man who climbs down, who empties himself, who takes the form of a servant, who finds that to lose his life is to find it. That is strength and weakness. When God chooses to work through weakness, it is not because he needs a display of divine irony. It is because weakness creates space for humility, space for trust, space for God's glory to be the center rather than man's ability. A strong man might draw attention to himself. A weak man who is filled with God will point all attention heavenward. And perhaps this is the great secret of spiritual authority, that the more emptied a man becomes of himself, the more room God has to fill him with his power. The very things we would seek to avoid, failure, dependence, limitation, become in the hands of God the tools by which we are made strong. There is a quiet dignity in weakness when it is surrendered to God. It becomes a doorway to grace, not a barrier to it. And those who walk through that door find that they are not diminished by their frailty, but transformed by it. They learn, not just in theory, but in the marrow of their being, that when they are weak, then they are strong. When God sets his heart on using a man for his purposes, he does not begin by adding to him. He begins by taking away. He does not first equip with public authority, gifts, or influence. Instead, he often moves in quiet, hidden ways to dismantle the man's sense of self that is rooted in flesh, his pride, his confidence in his own wisdom, his dependence on earthly credentials. This is not a punishment, but a sacred unmaking, for the man God intends to use must first be undone, not ruined, but reformed, not discarded, but refined. And the first step in this divine preparation is to take apart all the false identities the man has unknowingly built. It is common for us to build our worth around what we do, what we possess, or how we are perceived. We take pride in our intellect, our skills, our achievements, and even our sense of moral rightness. But these are fragile foundations, vulnerable to the shifting winds of circumstance. If God is to entrust us with work that touches eternity, he cannot allow us to rely on such unstable ground. So he begins to remove these layers, not to leave us empty, but to show us how little they truly were. What once seemed solid begins to crack. The job fails, the title is lost, the praise grows silent. The man who once found strength in being needed may suddenly find himself alone. The one who found affirmation in ministry may be called to a season of stillness. All the things he leaned on, even with good intentions, begin to slip through his hands. This unmaking can feel like failure. It can feel like rejection, but it is in fact the early movement of grace. God is drawing the man away from illusions. He is pulling him out of the shallow pool of self-dependence into the deep ocean of trust. The man who is being undone will wrestle. He may question, he may grieve, but these are holy birth pangs. The man is being born again, not in the sense of salvation, but in the sense of sanctified usefulness. The man God uses cannot carry the old self with him into the new calling. He must be stripped of it, slowly, painfully, but purposefully. There is an intimacy with God that only comes in this undoing. When all else is taken, when the distractions are peeled away, the man is left with one question: is God enough? And not just in theory or doctrine, but in lived experience. When all supports are removed and the voice of the crowd is silent, does the man still worship? Does he still believe? This is not an exam, it is a revelation. God is not testing the man to see if he is revealing what is already within him, and then reshaping it. It is the kindness of God to show us our foundations before the house is too tall to withstand collapse. He does not shame the man in this process. He fathers him through it. The undoing often leads the man into wilderness places, seasons of quietness, of waiting, of being misunderstood, and it is there that he finds what he could never have seen in the crowded places. That the voice of God is not always in the wind or the fire, but in the still, small whisper. In the wilderness, the man learns to hear differently. He begins to see his value not in his output, but in his being. He learns to rest not in his efforts, but in the sufficiency of Christ. This is not passivity, it is alignment. The man is no longer striving to prove himself. He is becoming a vessel that can carry God's glory without cracking under the weight. The undoing also changes how the man sees others. Once stripped of pride and ambition, he no longer views people as tools to build his platform. He sees them as souls, deeply loved by the same God who broke him in love. His leadership becomes servant-hearted. His authority is marked by compassion. He speaks not from a place of self-importance, but from the overflow of what he has received in private. He does not need to be seen because he knows he is known. He does not need to be celebrated because he has found joy in obedience. The man God unbuilds becomes a man God can entrust with his work. He is not perfect, but he is pliable. He is not fearless, but he is faithful. He is no longer carrying the burden of pretending to be enough, because he has met the one who is. And in this transformation, the man becomes not just useful, but usable. Ready to serve not his own legacy, but the will of the Father, who lovingly took him apart to make him whole. When we speak of suffering in the Christian life, we are not referring to random pain or misfortune that simply interrupts our plans. We are speaking of something deeper, something that, under the sovereign hand of God, becomes a tool not just for discipline or testing, but for shaping. Suffering in God's hands is a chisel, and not a dull or reckless one, but a precise, purposeful instrument that carves the rough soul into something fit for divine use. Pain, for the believer, is never pointless. When submitted to God, it becomes a refining fire that burns away what cannot remain and leaves behind a soul purified and prepared. God does not waste the suffering of those he loves. This is a hard truth, especially in the moments when suffering comes without explanation. Illness strikes, relationships fracture, dreams wither, doors close, silence lingers, and the immediate instinct is to resist, to escape, to question the goodness of God or the accuracy of our faith. But in those very moments, if we pause and look through the eyes of trust rather than fear, we may begin to see that this pain is not a sign of God's absence, but a mark of his nearness. The chisel only works when it is pressed close to the stone. There is no saint in Scripture who was used greatly by God and yet escaped suffering. Abraham had to lay his promised son on an altar. Job was stripped of nearly everything and left in ashes. David, anointed as king, spent years fleeing for his life. Paul was imprisoned, shipwrecked, beaten, and burdened beyond measure. And the Lord Jesus himself was called the man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. If Christ, in perfect obedience, did not avoid suffering, why would those who follow him expect a different path? The call to follow Christ is not a guarantee of ease. It is often the beginning of a deeper breaking. But that breaking is not to harm, it is to prepare. The chiseling effect of suffering touches the deepest parts of the human heart. It reveals what words cannot. It exposes what lies beneath the surface, the hidden fears, the subtle idols, the misplaced trust. When everything is comfortable and well ordered, it is easy to believe we are surrendered. But when suffering enters and we cannot fix it or explain it away, then the truth rises to the surface. What we really believe about God is revealed not in our theology, but in our tears. The man who walks through suffering with God does not come out the same as he entered. He may come out with scars, yes, but those scars are not shameful. They are sacred. They are the markings of one who has been touched by heaven's refining hand. In suffering, there is a unique kind of fellowship with God, a closeness that prosperity rarely provides. God does not shout from a distance during suffering. He whispers. He becomes the comforter, not just in name, but in experience. And often, it is in those long nights of unanswered questions and aching prayers that the soul learns to rest, not in understanding, but in presence. The man who has suffered with God comes to know something far richer than knowledge. He knows intimacy. He knows what it means to be held, even when nothing around him changes. He knows what it means to weep and still believe. Suffering also prepares a man to serve. It breaks the hardness of pride. It removes the arrogance of presumption. It replaces judgment with compassion. The man who has been carved by pain does not look at others from a distance. He draws near. He understands. He does not speak with condescension, but with empathy. His words are not loud, but they carry weight because they are spoken from a place of authenticity. The suffering he has endured becomes the soil in which wisdom grows. He does not offer cheap answers because he knows the cost of real ones. When God uses suffering as a chisel, it is always with the final image in mind. He sees not what we are in the moment, but what we are becoming. Like a master sculptor who sees a figure in a block of marble, he cuts with purpose. We feel the strike, but he sees the shape. And while we cry out under the blade, he is patiently, lovingly working on something that we may not yet understand. The image of Christ formed in us. This is the ultimate goal, not comfort, not success, but conformity to the Son. And suffering, more than any other tool, makes this possible. It is not easy to welcome suffering. No one desires the chisel. But if we belong to God, and if our desire is to be used by Him, we cannot despise the tool He uses most often. For in His hands the chisel is not cruel, it is kind, and the shape it leaves behind is something far more beautiful than what was there before. Throughout the Bible, we find a recurring pattern among those whom God calls to great works. Each of them undergoes a process of breaking, a time of suffering and refinement, before they are entrusted with their divine purpose. The stories of Moses, David, Job, Peter, Paul, and even Christ himself are not just accounts of extraordinary individuals. They are testimonies of God's method in shaping the lives of His servants. And through their journeys we see that the greatest of God's servants are often the most broken. Moses is a perfect example. He was born a Hebrew, raised as an Egyptian prince, and was trained in all the wisdom and power of the world's mightiest empire. Yet, when the time came for him to deliver Israel, he failed in his own strength. His attempt to free the Israelites by his own hand led to murder and exile. For 40 years, Moses wandered in the desert, humbled and broken, a far cry from the ambitious, self-assured man he had been. It was in the wilderness, stripped of his own grandeur and self-reliance, that Moses encountered God in the burning bush. God had not forgotten him. He had been preparing him. The man who was once self-sufficient, relying on his education and position, was now ready to be used by God to free a nation. But Moses' call came after a deep season of personal breaking, of being undone in order to be remade. David too was broken before he was crowned. The young shepherd who was anointed king of Israel had no immediate access to the throne. Instead, he spent years in the wilderness, fleeing from King Saul, living as a fugitive and enduring hardship and betrayal. David could have claimed the throne by force, but he didn't. The years in the desert were not wasted. They prepared David's heart. Through his suffering, God developed in him the humility and compassion necessary for a leader who would govern with justice and mercy. David's relationship with God, cultivated in the quiet of the wilderness, became the foundation for his leadership. His psalms, often born from times of deep personal struggle, demonstrate the depth of his brokenness and the strength he found in God alone. Job's story is another vivid illustration of divine breaking. Job, a man who was wealthy, upright and righteous, suddenly faced the total collapse of his life. His wealth, his health, and his children were all taken from him in a series of devastating blows. In his suffering, Job questioned, he complained, and he even cursed the day of his birth. Yet, through it all, God never abandoned him. Job's wrestle with God brought him to a place where he could say, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." Job's suffering was not punishment. It was a deep personal encounter with God that led to greater understanding, humility, and reverence. Job's brokenness was not wasted. It was the crucible in which his faith was tested, purified, and proven. The New Testament is filled with stories of brokenness leading to divine purpose, and the Apostle Peter provides a poignant example. Peter was the bold disciple, always quick to speak, quick to act, and full of confidence in his loyalty to Jesus. But after denying Christ 3 times, he was devastated by his failure. His self-assurance was shattered, and he could not reconcile his actions with his identity as one of Jesus' closest disciples. Yet Jesus, in his grace, sought Peter out after his resurrection and gently restored him, asking, "Do you love me?" Peter's restoration was not immediate or easy, but it was complete. Peter was broken of his pride and self-sufficiency, and in that brokenness he became the pillar of the early church. The strength Peter demonstrated in the book of Acts was not born out of his natural confidence, but from his brokenness and dependence on Christ. His failure, followed by restoration, was the preparation God used to equip him for the task ahead. Paul's life also serves as a profound testament to the necessity of brokenness in preparing someone for God's calling. As Saul, Paul was zealous for the law, confident in his own righteousness and knowledge, yet God radically intervened in his life, blinding him on the road to Damascus. Paul's physical blindness mirrored his spiritual blindness, and for 3 days he was in darkness, utterly dependent on God. This was Paul's breaking. The man who once stood tall in his own righteousness now saw his own sin and the sheer sufficiency of God's grace. Through this deep breaking, Paul was transformed into the apostle who would go on to plant churches, write epistles, and spread the gospel to the ends of the earth. His years of suffering, beatings, imprisonment, and rejection were the forge in which his spiritual authority was tested and solidified. God used Paul's brokenness to shape him into one of the most influential figures in Christian history. Finally, we cannot forget the example of Jesus Christ himself. Though sinless, Jesus endured the ultimate breaking. He was crucified, forsaken by his Father, and suffered the weight of the world's sin. The Son of God, in perfect communion with the Father, experienced profound isolation and pain. And yet, this was the very means by which salvation was brought to the world. Jesus' brokenness, his willingness to endure for the sake of others, is the model for every Christian. His brokenness was not the end, but the beginning of the greatest redemptive act in human history. Through his suffering, he brought salvation to humanity and became the ultimate high priest who understands our weaknesses and sympathizes with our pain. These stories show us that God does not call the equipped, he equips the called, but often through a process of unmaking and breaking. The deeper the call, the deeper the breaking. And though it is painful, the breaking is not an end, but a beginning. The beginning of a life that can be used by God to accomplish his purposes. Each of these individuals underwent a process of personal devastation that, when surrendered to God, became the very means by which they were prepared for greatness. Through suffering, they were shaped into vessels that could carry the glory of God in ways that would have been impossible had they not been broken first. The idea that God's greatest servants are often those who have been broken and shaped by divine hands is not just a theological concept. It is the lived experience of many faithful followers throughout history. Those who are chosen by God to accomplish his purposes are rarely those who appear the most capable by worldly standards. Instead, they are often those who have experienced profound moments of personal failure, suffering, and brokenness. It is in these moments of vulnerability that God is able to work most powerfully, using the shattered pieces of a person's life to create something beautiful and useful for his kingdom. In the kingdom of God, brokenness is not a disqualification, it is a prerequisite. The very essence of spiritual maturity and usefulness in God's hands comes from the process of being stripped of self-sufficiency and pride. We may start with natural gifts, talents, and abilities, but to be truly used by God, we must first be willing to lay down our own strength and trust in his. This act of surrender can be excruciating, as it forces us to confront the areas of our lives where we have placed our hope and identity in things other than God. Yet it is only through this process of breaking that we become capable of fulfilling the calling he has placed upon our lives. The story of the Apostle Paul exemplifies this truth powerfully. Before his conversion, Paul was a zealous persecutor of the church. He was driven by a deep conviction, but it was a conviction rooted in his own understanding and righteousness. God, however, saw something greater in him. He didn't merely want to transform Paul's actions. He wanted to transform his heart. The blinding light on the road to Damascus was not just a physical event, it was a symbolic moment where Paul's spiritual blindness was exposed. For 3 days, Paul was in darkness, utterly dependent on God. This period of brokenness and humility was crucial for shaping Paul into the man God needed him to be. His life, filled with suffering, shipwrecks, imprisonments, and beatings, was the refining fire that tested his faith and strengthened his reliance on God's grace. Similarly, consider the story of Peter. Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples, was a man who was filled with self-confidence, often speaking before thinking. He was quick to declare his loyalty to Jesus, even boasting that he would never deny him no matter what. Yet, in the midst of Jesus' trial, Peter denied him 3 times, fulfilling the very prophecy Jesus had made. Peter's failure was devastating. It shattered his self-image and left him with feelings of guilt and shame. However, in the midst of his brokenness, Jesus sought him out. He didn't rebuke Peter. Instead, he restored him, asking, "Do you love me?" 3 times, 1 for each denial. In that restoration, Peter was remade. The brokenness of his failure became the foundation for his strength in the future. Peter went on to become one of the greatest leaders of the early church. But his leadership was marked by humility, grace, and a profound understanding of the mercy of God. His brokenness was the very means by which he was equipped to serve. In many ways, we are all like Moses, Peter, and Paul. We often build our lives around our perceived strengths, our accomplishments, and our natural abilities. We believe that God will use us because of these qualities. But God is not interested in using us because of our strengths. He desires to use us because of our willingness to be weak in His presence. We must be broken of our self-sufficiency before we can be filled with His strength. Just as a clay pot must first be molded and fired in the kiln before it can hold anything of value, so too must we undergo the process of breaking and shaping before we can be filled with the fullness of God's power. One of the most difficult aspects of this process is the emotional and spiritual pain that often accompanies it. We may feel abandoned or misunderstood, especially during seasons of suffering. However, this pain is not without purpose. Just as a sculptor carefully chisels away at a block of marble to reveal the form hidden within, God is using our pain to shape us into the person He has called us to be. The pain is not the end of the story. It is the means by which God molds us into something far more beautiful and valuable than we could ever imagine. This truth can be difficult to accept, particularly when we are in the midst of hardship, but it is in these moments that we are most open to God's transformative work. Furthermore, brokenness teaches us to rely on God alone. We cannot fulfill the purpose He has for us in our own strength. We cannot accomplish His will through our own wisdom or power. It is only when we are broken, when we have no other options left, that we truly begin to lean on God and trust in His provision. This is a humbling but necessary lesson, and it is one that must be learned in the crucible of suffering. Once we learn to trust God in our brokenness, we become vessels that He can use to accomplish His work. Ultimately, brokenness does not make us useless. It makes us usable. Through the process of breaking, God refines us and prepares us to bear His image and His glory. The very things that we see as weaknesses, our failures, our vulnerabilities, our pain, are the places where God's grace can shine the brightest. He takes the broken pieces of our lives and weaves them together into a beautiful tapestry that reflects His power, His love, and His glory. In this way, we are not diminished by our brokenness. We are transformed by it, becoming more fully the people He has called us to be. In conclusion, the truth that God breaks the man He wants to use is not one of despair, but of hope. It reveals a process that, though painful, is ultimately for our good. Through suffering, failure, and the breaking of our own strength, we are refined and reshaped by the divine hands of a loving God. This breaking is not a punishment, but a purposeful preparation for the work He has called us to. As we let go of our pride, self-sufficiency, and earthly dependencies, we make room for God's power, wisdom, and grace to fill us. The greatest servants of God throughout history, Moses, David, Paul, Peter, and even Christ Himself, demonstrated that it is in brokenness that we become vessels for His glory. When we are willing to face the pain of brokenness, to surrender our self-made identities and acknowledge our dependence on God, we discover that the very things that once seemed like defeats become the foundation of our greatest victories. Through this divine shaping, we are not only prepared for the tasks God has for us, but we also grow closer to the heart of God, learning to trust Him more fully and finding our identity not in what we do, but in who we are in Him. Our brokenness, when submitted to God, becomes the doorway to a greater purpose, a more intimate relationship with the Creator, and a life used for His eternal glory.